Inspiration for Teachers podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Matthew, welcome to Inspiration for Teachers. I'm so glad that you have joined us on the show here today.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
What I would like to do is just give our listeners a bit of background as to who you are and what you've done. So could you start off by sharing that with us, please?
Yes, for sure. I'm Matthew Leeming. I'm the relatively new head teacher of King's School in Winchester. I've been teaching for a little over 20 years. I started in Liverpool, and I've taught in state comprehensives in Hull, and in Peterborough prior to moving to Hampshire, and this is my second headship. I was previously head teacher of Crofton School, which is in Stubbington, just outside Fareham. My subject was geography, but over the course of those 20 years, I've taught quite a few other subjects too.
I was going to say, in teaching, we tend to teach quite a few different topics, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you get more senior, you end up sometimes filling the gaps on the timetable.
So you're very knowledgeable, Matthew, and you've got a lot of experience. So what I'd like to do now is dive into issues surrounding the shortage of people going into head teachership roles. Do you think that is a current problem that's getting worse? And if so, what do you think needs to be happening in order to recruit senior leaders into those positions and good leaders?
I'm told that it is a current problem that's getting worse, and I think the evidence for this is seen in the shrinking fields, particularly at primary. So when governors place advertisements for head teacher positions, they find that there are fewer applicants and sometimes no applicants at all. I think there are probably a number of reasons for that, but the most critical one is the very great accountability pressure that heads often feel around inspection. And so the fear of a hostile inspection is always present for head teachers and for people, I think, thinking about becoming head teachers. And the consequences of a poor inspection outcome are, career threatening for heads in a way perhaps that they aren't for other people further down the hierarchy. So I think that's the issue. And what you do about that, I suppose, is firstly, we need to emphasise the positives, because although there is that accountability pressure, there's lots of ways in which being a head teacher is the very best job in the world, and certainly the best job in the school. And then also, we need to make sure that the inspection regime remains rigorous, but is humane and supportive.
Is that the reason you introduced the rolling assistant headship programme at King's School? Is that to try and encourage people to move into senior leadership roles?
Yeah, that's part of it. I mean, I think everyone benefits from a programme like that, in that the existing leadership team benefits enormously from the regular injection of originality and energy. And I hope that the people who take part in the scheme are not put off the idea of senior leadership, enjoy it, and absolutely become more likely to try and get themselves promoted permanently.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Matthew. So this trips on quite nicely to what excites you right now about the education profession.
I think there's no doubt at all that schools generally are better now than they have ever been. I think that anyone who's worked in schools for over the last 20 years can't fail to see that. I think we are much more skilled. I think we're much better at meeting the needs, the very varied needs of individual children. I think that the sense of moral purpose that you see in staff rooms has never been stronger. And I also think we're lucky in that teaching remains, or working in schools remains a very sort of optimistic business. And it's lovely to hear and see colleagues enjoying what they do and believing that they are doing something important and good. So I think there are lots and lots of reasons to feel positive about working at school.
And then the flip side of that coin, which can sometimes be a bit controversial, is what aspects of education would you most like to change and why?
I think the thing that worries me most is our failure to design an assessment system that rewards those who are not highly academic or who don't choose a highly academic route. And I think we've stepped backwards in some ways, in that GCSE was an advance over O-level and CSE, And I think the introduction of BTECs and other vocational qualifications for 16-year-olds was also very positive. I think that the diplomas were, an awful lot of work went into the design of the diplomas, and I think a great deal of good was done. And I think all of that's been swept away in the last 5 years, or a lot of it's been swept away. And there is an emphasis on rigorous and very traditional academic study, which suits a proportion of young people, but doesn't suit another and rather large proportion. And I worry that actually the government hasn't really got an answer to that. And therefore the education profession is struggling slightly to find its own answer. And I worry that we're going to go backwards, and the sorts of students who have done pretty well in schools over the last 10 years may do less well, with consequences for them and for all of us.
Do you think it's best then for the education profession to have a more open conversation about how we support those learners and we take more control of that situation? Should we be taking it more into our own hands?
I think there are signs that that's happening. The professional association that I'm a member of, ASCL, is involved in a thing that they call the Great Education Debate. And that's absolutely and explicitly a move to take back control of the curriculum and take back control of assessment, and to come up with constructive and practical ways of meeting those children's needs. But you can't do that without at least the acquiescence of government. Now we're in a bit of a hiatus, and until the election, no one will be prepared to make any radical decisions. And so I think absolutely right. I think the professionals need to take this agenda into our own hands, but it won't be possible to make permanent and legally based changes or improvements until after the election, I fear.
Sign up via the website to receive our Inspiration for Teachers Community Digest and receive all of our best recommended resources.
So let's move on to your professional challenge and really why you're here with us today.
I hope I have something to say about the challenge of moving on from one school to another as head, and the pitfalls of that and the experiences that I've had. Very often one moves schools when one is promoted into headship for the first time, and I did that. And then sometimes one may move on to a second headship. Having done that, I do have some reflections on it. I think the first thing I'd say is the critical importance of understanding the circumstances of the school that you've arrived in, how successful it is, how successful it's perceived to be, how happy the staff and the pupils are. The answers to those questions tell you how much you have to change. In my first school, I arrived and there was a not particularly favourable Ofsted inspection very early on, which from my point of view was quite helpful. It made it clear that it was imperative to change things and to challenge things and to check things as well. Whereas at my current school, I arrived, the school's full, it's a great result, has a fantastic reputation, and the brief from governors at the interview was very explicitly just not to mess it up, basically.
That's a big challenge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But also, they said that, but they also said there's an Ofsted imminent, and the school's jolly well got to do well. And schools are immensely complicated organisms, and it's not immediately obvious when you first arrive what is significant and also what is connected to what. My first conclusion from all of that is it's vital to take time to listen to everyone and to get oneself around the school. So I had in both schools actually one-to-one meetings with every member of staff, and I also took every class in the form of a PSHE lesson. And I also think it's very important to be constantly sharing one's interim conclusions with people who know the school well. It's a bit like being an inspector, at least on the more constructive model of inspection. One is forming hypotheses, one is checking them, and one is sharing one's developing picture, one's developing understanding with the leadership team.
There are a couple of things that strike me about what you've just said there. So understanding the circumstances, so having all those one-to-one meetings, meeting with the pupils, that's a lot of opinions and content to take on board. So how do you wade through all of that information?
One shouldn't over-conclude from any one piece of evidence, because as you say, almost everything you have is opinion. And also, of course, you don't know to start off with who you're talking to. So you have to take people at face value. And, everyone presumably comes with their own agenda. But when you first arrive, you don't necessarily know what that is. And people who are absolutely committed to the success of the school may have an emotional involvement that clouds their judgment. You have to be aware of that. Even people who are wise and knowledgeable can be wrong. So you have to be aware of that. And so it's a bit of a minefield, really. You have to take everything into account, but use your professional judgment and the experience that you have to decide what is significant and what is true and what is connected to what.
It's a real art form.
Yeah. It's certainly not something you could learn from a book. Clearly, you make mistakes. But one of the more helpful things that I was told before I became a head was that somebody said, Matthew, as a head, you will make literally dozens of decisions every day, and inevitably some of them will be wrong, and, don't beat yourself up about that.
So let's go back to the two different scenarios that you were in. So you had that Ofsted report with the first school, and it very much laid out for you what needed to be done. And then you come to your new school, and pretty much it's in a good position. And you said about challenging each school. So how do you set about putting that challenge in place, what you are going to challenge?
In the first situation, where there is a clear mandate, indeed, a necessity to change things, it is easier, particularly if most people accept the conclusions that we'd all been given. Whereas, in a situation where the school's been very successful for a very long time, there will be a presumption against change. So you have to employ all of your arts of persuasion and empathy to convince people, really. And also you need to be very careful, particularly on the second headship, of not transplanting solutions from your previous lives. Because a thing which works beautifully in one context and which is highly appropriate may be absolutely inappropriate in the new place. And I think being aware of that risk is very important.
Every school is completely unique, and I have a friend that works at a very challenging school, and she's an excellent teacher, and she always says to me, you should come and teach at my school. And I was like, if I went and taught at your school, I would absolutely die, because it's not what I'm used to. The kids would eat me alive, whereas, I would consider that I was a competent and good teacher, but in a different scenario, probably not so.
Absolutely. So the environment that you're in is everything, really. As a new head, you need to respect that. So in formulating a new strategic direction, one needs to combine elements of what's already there with elements of one's own philosophy. I don't know, maybe 70-30 or 80-20, depending on how well it's all working. But it's absolutely vital to change and adapt to the new environment and become a slightly different animal. But on the other hand, presumably one wouldn't have been given the job if somebody didn't think that you were going to bring something new and distinctive.
And there must be an element of pressure concerning all of that, because people want to see results. So you've got to do all of that, I presume, very quickly, but without completely messing it up, and also driving that challenge within a certain time frame, because there must be a lot of pressure that if you don't start demonstrating results within a certain amount of time, you're effectively out. Is that the case?
Again, very, very much depends on circumstances. So if you're lucky enough, as I have been, to take over a school which has got a very strong Ofsted pedigree, I think there is less pressure to move quickly. And indeed, there's no need to move quickly. So I think I've been very lucky in my second school in that it's been better. It's the most appropriate thing to do has been to move slowly. There isn't particularly a pressure to demonstrate rapid change, almost a pressure not to. However, whereas if you've taken a school on which is requires improvement or in some Ofsted category, then absolutely the pressure is on. And I think it feels unfortunately similar to football management. And I think heads and people around heads have got into that way of thinking, and they think that if this set of results or if this inspection doesn't work out, then they need to get sacked as a football manager would. And I think that's a really, really unhealthy way of thinking.
Well, if you think about how long it takes to implement change, you really need to have a 5-year plan, don't you? I mean, you need to take a whole year group through from year 7 all the way to year 11 in order to be implementing what you need to implement.
Yes, I think that's fair. And it's very, very important to avoid early radical change that you can't retreat from, because people do make mistakes, and without understanding the complicated organism that you've taken on, you can easily do the wrong thing if you are precipitate.
And you said at the start that there were quite a few pitfalls to moving from one school to another school, and we've talked about those, but is there some really classic shining ones that you've got examples of that other people could learn from?
A couple of general points. I think you probably get a head start just by not being your predecessor. So somebody very experienced said to me that he thought he had alienated about 10% of the staff every year, and that therefore after 10 years it was definitely time to move on. So I think, but by being somebody different, you get a bit of a boost just from that. But on the other hand, the flip side of that is that people are used to a head teacher. Usually there's been somebody established before you get there, and they may not realise that you are different, and so your actions can be misinterpreted in the light of what they would have meant if the previous person had done them. So I think it's innocent and well-meaning, and one forgets that it's actually, it's not a blank canvas, and people may have had all sorts of experiences of the previous regime. And just because you're not the previous regime, it doesn't mean that necessarily they will immediately realise that. So in talking to people and in listening to what they have to say and in taking decisions and actions, one needs to be aware that people will have had an opinion about the previous head, which they may well transfer to you. But in terms of your specific question, things to avoid or things that work well, I made a terrible blunder at my first school regarding socks. And I was at a meeting of the school council, and a very nice person at the school council said, "Oh, sir, it's terrible, the rule about socks. We should be allowed to wear any socks that we want. There shouldn't be a rule about socks." And I thought, quick win here, caught a bit of popularity with the pupils. So I announced a relaxation of the sock rule, which actually only had two effects. One was that for about a week we had a plethora of splendidly multicoloured socks. But more importantly, I think every single member of staff thought, "Who is this clown? What's going on here?" That's an example of a precipitate decision that is difficult to retreat from. It was also an example of putting much too much weight on the thing that one person had said. And I think there's a general point there for leaders, in that any one comment or any one piece of evidence is very unlikely to be conclusive.
That's a really valid point. So do you think we've covered everything there, Matthew, with those pitfalls?
A couple of thoughts. I think that you can't communicate too much. A colleague at our school, my current school, came up with a brilliant idea, which was a weekly email to all pupils. And I like to think that the pupils now feel even more informed and even more valued at our school than they did previously. And it's such an easy thing to do, and has gone down very well. So equally important to keep staff informed. So whether that's via regular briefings or whether that's via focus groups or whether that's via weekly messages or whatever, that's essential, really.
It was really interesting, actually, because I was reading about leadership, and one of the issues that was coming up was you might be very good at knowing what your vision is and delivering that vision in terms of sending emails, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's being communicated effectively and you're getting buy-in on your vision.
I think we all probably spend too much time with keyboards and screens, and we all spend too little time talking to other human beings. I think that's a real danger, and particularly a danger for senior leaders, because of course, you can send out emails at the weekend, you can send them at dead of night, and there's no limit to it really, and people do stop listening, and there is no substitute for face-to-face contact.
Wise words. So let's move on to our inspiration round, and it's designed to give people quick snippets of information that they can go off and explore in their own time, but also to inspire. So could you share with us your proudest educational moment, please?
Oh, gosh. I suppose it sounds terribly selfish, but I do think becoming a head, though an enormous privilege, is also quite a challenge. and I didn't come ahead the first time I tried. I had to go to a number of interviews, go through the selection process quite a few times, and that was emotionally extremely demanding. And so getting one's first headship it felt to me like a proper achievement, really. But that's terribly selfish, I suppose. More generally, since I've been in leadership positions, sometimes people have said nice things about the schools in which I've worked. Every time somebody comments favourably on the happy atmosphere or tangible improvements which have been made and which I can feel some association with, that feels really good.
Let's move on to best advice you've ever been given, and you covered quite a lot of that in your professional challenge, but what would you say that is?
Oh, right. As a teacher, very definitely, I remember Gordon Bloomer, who was the geography lecturer at the Southampton University where I did my PGCE, said, "Remember, Matthew, every lesson, it's not what you will do, it's what the children will do." And that stuck with me, actually, and I think that's been extremely helpful. I've got a couple of others. Somebody said, "Remember, Friday always comes," which I found quite helpful, particularly early on in Headship.
I love thinking that on a Monday.
Well, on the other hand, terrible one. When I started as my second school, just as a geography teacher, I remember on the very first day in September, beautiful September day, walking from the car park up to the school, coming alongside a much older teacher and saying, "Isn't it a lovely morning?" And receiving the response, "Yes, only another 194 to go."
Oh, no.
I never, ever want to be like that.
I was talking to Charlotte from the University of Portsmouth when we did her podcast episode, and she very much stressed that if you're feeling like that, it is time to leave the profession because you're adding no value to the children and you're just doing yourself harm. So why are you doing it?
Yeah. When I started, I think in most staff rooms, there were quite a few teachers who clearly didn't like teenagers. I thought then, why on earth would you put yourself through this every day? Whereas another way in which the profession has changed for the better is that I think that those people have almost all gone. And actually, almost everybody still working in schools does really like teenagers. And therefore, they will, I hope, agree that it's the best job in the world.
I think the two major requirements you've got to have if you're going into education is, one, you've got to have a passion for your subject, but two, you've got to have a passion for children because they are the people you are going to be working with day in, day out. And if that is not there, you're not going to do very well trying to communicate the passion for your subject to those group of people.
Well, absolutely. And they're very distinctive, aren't they, teenagers? And they can be very, very frustrating and very difficult and very, very annoying, frankly, but lovely as well. And it's not for everyone. And to say, certainly 20 years ago, there seemed to be quite a few people who had sort of drifted into it and for whom it very clearly wasn't.
Well, it's good that they've gone. So let's move on to your sources of inspiration.
I've been very fortunate to work with some extraordinary colleagues and some extraordinarily moral people. A friend of mine that I worked with when I was first head of geography in a school in Peterborough, and who went on to Headship and has tragically died quite young, was very influential in terms of giving me a sense of moral purpose. And he was so evidently and profoundly committed to children. I mean, he was quite a religious person, and that came through in a very good way. But I think prior to that, I had known in my head that it was a vocation and not a job. But in seeing the way he talked to and listened to and worked with young people, I became properly convinced in my heart.
So let's move on to a personal leadership or teaching habit that is of value to you in your day-to-day practice that you think somebody else could learn from.
Yeah, I send birthday cards to every member of staff. And what it does is it means that at least once a year I can write a personal note thanking people. And to me it just seemed completely obvious. I don't think everybody does it, so it doesn't cost much either in time or money, but it goes a very long way. The risk, however, is that you need to set up for yourself very clearly defined rules about who gets one, in the sense that if somebody's birthday is in the middle of August, you've either got to you've either got to spend the whole of the last day of the summer term writing a lot of birthday cards, or you've got to decide that they unfortunately don't get one. I know there was some slight upset over one weekend early on.
This is our final question. A resource for our listeners that you think would be of value.
In terms of, I went straight away to Classroom as you were talking there. As a geography teacher, absolutely splendid online resource by a fella called Hans Rösling, and I think it's World Mapper, and it's just fantastic. And he's a very, very enthusiastic Swede, I think, and he deals with development statistics in an extremely engaging way. So that's a teaching resource. In terms of a resource that I found useful as a head, the book that struck me most strongly most recently was Matthew Syed's Bounce. He's very much into the idea of purposeful practice, and he uses all sorts of examples, many from sport, but not only from sport, to point out the value of purposeful practice. And it was a good read and quite short.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's been extremely valuable. I've learned a lot, and I know our listeners will as well.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Before we come to the end of the show and we say goodbye, if listeners would like to make contact with you, what is the best way in which they should contact you?
Phone the school, King's School in Winchester, or m4matthew.leeming@kingswinchester.hants.sch.uk.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.